1 year ago, Taliban forces completed their takeover of Kabul, sending President Ashraf Ghani into hiding and taking over the leadership of Afghanistan. This time period was characterized by the chaotic and heavily criticized withdrawal of Western forces, images of people risking their lives to flee the country, and bizarre videos of Taliban fighters enjoying themselves in deserted theme parks. And under the last year of Taliban rule, things have changed quite a lot for Afghanistan. Controversially, the Taliban have dialed back on its promises to improve women's rights, imposing stricter Sharia laws, and according to the UN Security Council, the economy has contracted by around 30 to 40%, leaving many stuck in poverty. While some improvements have been made, such as noticeably fewer civilian attacks, on the surface, Afghanistan paints a bleaker picture than it did 2 years ago. But after the hurricane, could we see a rainbow in Kabul? Is there any hope for Afghans under Taliban rule? Would another US intervention be beneficial for Afghanistan, or would it just add fuel to the fire? Should the US have withdrawn from Afghanistan?
So let's get to it. Should the U.S. have withdrawn from Afghanistan? Dear gentlemen, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation right after. So Colonel Kemp, please take the lead.
The answer is a very firm no. We should not have withdrawn from Afghanistan. We should have retained a presence at something like the level that there was there about a year before we pulled out, maybe around 10,000 troops, perhaps a bit more, on a permanent basis. And the reason that we needed to do that was because we needed to keep the Taliban out of government. We needed to prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a safe haven for terrorism, which it very clearly has again become.
Yes, and we will touch upon all of those bullet points in a split second. Dr. Oren, your take?
A disaster, Ellie. A disaster, Ellie. The withdrawal from Afghanistan sent an unequivocal message to the world of American weakness, of America's refusal to stand by its allies, and many despots in the world were taking notes, among them Mr. Putin, Mr. Xi in China. I think there's a direct connection between Russia's decision to invade Ukraine and America's hasty and, I think, irresponsible withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Last but not least, Mr. Faisal, your take?
The U.S. should have left Afghanistan at some point, but last year was not the right time to do so, especially knowing that the deal was so new and Afghanistan still needed more international attention, and the Taliban did not cut ties to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and Afghanistan could still have posed a threat to the world, as it proved in the last 1 year. So they should have left, but not last year. There should have been some more view onto it.
And speaking to that point exactly, and from this point onwards, gentlemen, please feel free to interact. It's not just the what, but the how. And a year on, we are hearing renewed claims or accusations even over the conduct, the handling, or lack thereof, more accurately, of the withdrawal. And my question to you, could it or should it have been done differently, Colonel Kemp?
The actual withdrawal itself was done in the most disastrous way you could imagine. There wasn't proper planning carried out in conjunction with the government of Afghanistan for the withdrawal. And that, in part, led to the disastrous situation we saw. There was a lack of appreciation, I think, by the United States, the UK, and other countries involved about how effective the Afghan National Security Forces would be in holding off the Taliban. It was also carried out at the height of fighting season. It's obviously that the Taliban are at their most potent at that time of year. Had it been delayed, proper planning carried out with the Afghan government, had it been delayed until the winter perhaps, at the very earliest, if it had to happen, then I think that we'd have seen probably a slightly different outcome. Maybe not a fundamentally different outcome, but there would not have been the disaster for Afghanistan and the global humiliation for the United States and Britain and the other NATO allies.
Mr. Faisal, is that the poor timing you were referring to, as Colonel Kemp just illustrated?
That's a very valid point, but that's not the only problem we had. Afghans were not part of this process from the very beginning. Not just the Afghans, but the European allies were also not part of it. I remember the European ambassador, he was saying that they know nothing about the Doha deal. This withdrawal of forces, those annexes of the deal are still not known to the people. Nobody knows, let alone Afghans. The Europeans don't know about it. That was another biggest problem that we had in that process. The third key challenge which was there was the hasty withdrawal. Like, they could have done it gradually. They had been there like for about 20 years, another 10 months, another 6 months, like a year or 2 years. Couldn't be big of a challenge. But the haste in the process, keeping Afghans away from the entire process, and then the time of the year that was there. Those were the three main challenges that we had. And still, nothing is clear for the people of Afghanistan. Nobody knows what has actually been signed there in Doha. Even the European allies, NATO allies, they don't know about it. So I think those were the three main problems that were there.
And Dr. Oren, there seems to be a full consensus over how poorly it was all planned or not planned at all. The fallout is obviously clear. Why is the Biden administration preventing, or rather avoiding delving into details and preventing learning any lessons?
Well, first of all, it's very embarrassed by the entire affair, as it should be. We're talking about a combination of a humanitarian disaster of immense proportions, coupled with a logistics disaster. We're talking about thousands and thousands of Afghanis who work with the United States, who applied for exit permits. Those permits were not processed. The many thousands of people at the Kabul airport who were left behind, some clinging to airplanes, falling off of airplanes. Another 270 Afghans and 13 U.S. Marines killed by a suicide bomber. The American response to that killed 10 innocent Afghanis. It was just one humanitarian disaster after another. And the message goes out, hey, don't trust these Americans in the future. They're going to abandon you. But on top of that, the logistical the disaster of countless billions of dollars of military equipment that were abandoned, including an entire airbase, tanks, jeeps, a humiliating picture of Taliban soldiers reenacting the Marines' erection of the American flag on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima in World War II, except the Afghans were all wearing American equipment, carrying American guns, and raising the Taliban flag. How humiliating can you get? So obviously the Biden administration doesn't want to delve into that. And perhaps most cynically, it's relying on the fact that a majority of Americans actually wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, both Republicans and Democrats, because isolationism is the flavor of the day in the United States. It's actually one of the few issues on which Democrats and Republicans have agreed in the past.
Dr. Oren, the commander of U.S. Central Command at the time, General Kenneth Frank McKenzie, as it is known in public, said the U.S. simply lost track of why it was there to begin with. Can we say that America's longest war is simply a failure?
Well, in certain actions, it was a failure. If the idea was initially to rid the country of al-Qaeda, here we see that al-Qaeda has come back. Amin Zawahiri being eliminated by an American drone missile several weeks ago. Al-Qaeda is back. But I think that the mission changed. The initial mission after the September 11th attack was to rid Afghanistan of al-Qaeda. But then it became nation building. And many countries in the past, and I think Colonel Kemp will recall this, the British also tried to build Afghanistan into a nation and failed. I don't know whether that goal was ever truly possible. But ultimately, the mission would have been to send a message to the world that America was staying. And having American troops in this strategically vital part of the world had a benefit which, to my mind, greatly outweighed the deficits, if you will, of remaining in Afghanistan. And now that has been lost.
And Colonel Kemp, speaking to that point, on top of all the disastrous element that we've already mentioned, there's this fundamental issue of American or Western allies in Afghanistan that were simply abandoned. Was it a matter of failing in practice to support them in the aftermath, or simply this deliberate strategy of cashing in?
I think there was a feeling in the US and also in Europe that the situation that occurred would not have occurred, certainly wouldn't have occurred so early. In other words, the collapse of the Kabul government wouldn't have happened either straight away or at all. And there was an optimism, a misplaced optimism on the basis of that. And the outcome of the speed in which the collapse occurred was that there was no real preparatory work taken to evacuate the people that we relied on and depended upon, the people like interpreters, contractors, other workers in Afghanistan who had essentially made our operation possible. We wouldn't have been able to do it without them. And now we've got some of them out. Many of them remain there in Afghanistan in risk, in fear of their life. And they have been hunted down and killed in some cases. And that, I think, not only is morally wrong, but it also is very bad for the West, because when next time we get involved in some kind of operation where we need local support, who's going to trust us? Who's going to rely on us to do that? I think it's going to be, it really damaged the reputation, the NATO reputation, in so many different ways, that just being one of them.
Yes, and we will get to how it all resonates elsewhere in the world. But before we conclude this part of the debate, Mr. Faisal, you know, the Taliban promised a softer version of its first stint in power. This is obviously not the case, very much the opposite. But was it all smooth talk, or was it Western naivete, or was it a genuine intention on behalf of the Taliban, and then this change of heart?
I think what we saw in the last 3 or 4 years, this new labeling of the Taliban, it was a very incorrect perception and idea. We were kept told by the Americans almost every single day that the Taliban have changed, that the new version, that the Taliban 002 are a better version. But what we have seen in the last year, like you rightly mentioned, they have changed, but only for worse. Yeah. Their priority still remains to be how Afghans trim their beards, what the Afghan women wear, not how to combat the Al-Qaeda, how to combat other terrorist groups, or how to provide employment opportunities for the Afghan people, or how to feed the hungry. So I think it was false and incorrect from the very beginning, and it still seems to be the case today, and we don't see anything better for the future.
Well, a wolf in a wolf's clothing this time around. No one can argue anything other than that. Dear gentlemen, we're taking a very short break, but when we get back, we continue our discussion and focus perhaps on how it all impacts American allies or Western allies across the world. We're taking a short break. Back in a bit with much more. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Colonel Richard Kemp, Dr. Michael Oren, and Mr. Javid Faisal. We're having some connectivity problems there, but hopefully he can chime in shortly. And before we dive back into the conversation, let's take a listen to some of the voices from the day the final American soldiers left Afghanistan.
Tonight is the last night of the 20 years of American troops' occupation. During these 20 years, the Americans have done a lot of damage to the Afghan state. What will happen to the Afghan state after this? I appeal to all our political leaders, elders and young people. Let's take the matters into our own hands. How long will we remain dependent on foreigners? Let's put our homeland together ourselves.
Today is the day of the departure of the Americans. After the departure of the foreigners, Afghans should start building their homeland again. They should resolve all political differences through dialogue and take concrete steps for the construction, stability, and peace of the country, and to take such measures for security that in the future the security of Afghanistan is never jeopardized.
Yes, and we all know how Kabul looks today. So my question to you, gentlemen, as we start another 30-second round each, from Taipei to Kyiv, what is the current state of Kabul? What message does it send to U.S. allies around the globe? Dr. Oren, please begin.
Message is rather clear, unfortunately, Ellie. It's that don't rely on the United States. And I think that the Taiwanese have internalized this. Certainly the Ukrainians have. And from Israel's perspective, and we have to talk about something about Israel's perspective, is it is also very disconcerting. The United States being our ultimate ally. And our allies in the region, our new allies under the Abraham Accords, also sense the withdrawal of the United States. And it's actually one of the animating processes behind the Abraham Accords,
right.
The realization on the part of Arab states that they have to unite with Israel to face common enemies.
And to take care of business on their own, if and when, and we'll get to that in a split second. Mr. Faisal, your take, what message does it send to U.S. allies across the globe?
It's disbelief, it's mistrust. What we had built in the last 20 years, it has gone. The Americans toppled the Taliban in 2001, and they brought back the Taliban in 2021, 20 years later. Nothing is left there. Nobody could trust anymore. Even the ones who put their lives at risk to support the U.S. mission, they have been abandoned. They are still fearing for their lives on the streets in Kabul, across Afghanistan.
Colonel Kemp, I have a feeling that you're sharing those sentiments.
Yeah, I would like to look also at what our enemies, because that's just as important,
right.
if not more so. And all you need to do is look into Eastern Europe now and see what's happening in Ukraine. I believe that's a direct result of the emboldenment of Putin when he saw what Biden did in Afghanistan. And yes, of course, he had every intention of taking Ukraine if he could. But I think what made him do it now was looking at Afghanistan. And also you're seeing the emboldenment of China. You're looking at a lot of saber over Taiwan, and of course also Iran, which is a particular interest to you out there.
And that takes me to my next question, Colonel Kemp. My impression is that China has gone all in with the Taliban. Where are we heading there?
China has been supporting the Taliban for many years, including paying Taliban to hunt down and kill Uyghurs escaping China into Afghanistan. They've been funding them. They've been funding their campaign against the West, as has, of course, Russia and Iran as well. They've all played a role in this, the big role by Pakistan. But yes, China wanted to have influence in Afghanistan. It now has probably behind Pakistan the greatest influence of any country outside Afghanistan. And so I think we can look with some horror on China's future actions in relation to Afghanistan, and I think partly also its relations with India, which is opposed. China's opposed to India and also opposed to Pakistan. So we will see an alliance there between Pakistan and China to push back on India.
And also very timely yesterday, Pakistan celebrated Independence Day, India, also on the day of that we marked the withdrawal. Dr. Oren, I will put it that way. Is the U.S. policy of getting out of the Middle Eastern quagmire sustainable at all?
No, I don't believe so, Ellie. I think that if you think you're going to go back for the Middle East is going to come after you. It's not like the American withdrawal from
They pull you back
Vietnam.
in.
In 1975, America could withdraw from Vietnam in 1975 and push those helicopters over the end of off the end of the aircraft carriers and go home and be pretty confident that the North Vietnamese were not going to follow America back to New York and Los Angeles. That's not the case in the Middle East. And the Middle East will come to the United States, whether in the form of terror, in the efforts to cut off oil supplies. Look what's happening now with Ukraine when the President Biden goes to the Gulf and gets a very chilly reception from the Gulf Arabs and anger. The United States is trying to cut a deal this very night with Iran that appears, according to reports appearing in the Western press, that will ease restrictions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, that will allow Iran to violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty by preventing the IAEA from investigating suspected nuclear sites. The message, once again, will be one of American weakness. It will be one of the inability of America's allies to truly trust the United States, and the United States contributing to the strengthening of the most serious enemy and threat to the Middle East, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And all of this while reports suggesting Al-Qaeda is already setting up in Afghanistan. And you, Mr. Faisal, what is next for the Taliban? Can anything or anyone undermine its rule or change its course?
I think there is still much to be done in Afghanistan. If the U.S. can at least fully implement the Doha deal it signed with the Taliban, this could be something positive going forward, not just for Afghanistan, but for this region and the world. And that's important to achieve, because what we have been seeing all this past year is that none of those chapters, the articles in the deal have been implemented. That's a big challenge. So if the U.S. or the world wants Afghanistan to be safe, not to be a threat to itself, to the region and the world, it has to pay attention. It has to hold Taliban accountable to the promises they had made to the U.S. in the Doha agreement. What we have seen in the past 1 year, the U.S. has been playing very nice with the Taliban, and this is not good for Afghanistan, the U.S., or the international community in general.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, we're nearing the end of our debate, so I would like to briefly ask all three of you, what would be the point when the international community decides to intervene again? Is there such a point at all, Colonel Kemp?
I think it's going to be a very high threshold. And we've just seen, we're watching now what's going on in Ukraine. Right. There is no Western intervention there to speak of. Yes, they provided some weapons to Ukraine. Yes, they provided, they've imposed harsh sanctions, but none of that has been effective in my view. It has had limited effect. And I really do believe even that if a NATO country was attacked, let's say the Balkan states, or even possibly Poland, I would very much doubt that NATO is going to come to their aid and send German, Italian, British, French soldiers to die fighting the Russians in a NATO country in Eastern Europe. It's a very bleak picture, but that's my perspective.
Dr. Oren, your thoughts?
I don't know about NATO. I still, NATO is a treaty obligation by the United States. It's hard to ignore that. That was not the case with Afghanistan. It's not even the case with Taiwan. But I'm sure that I have a long-standing wager with some of my colleagues about whether the United States would intervene militarily to defend Taiwan, and I'm highly skeptical of that.
Not even fully recognizing it officially. Mr. Faisal, your quick remarks before we have to wrap it up?
I believe the U.S. at some point will have to intervene because they are responsible for the mess that they have left behind. But we all know that China is going to be the priority for them today, like the global superpower rivalries. But this fight against terrorism is also part of that global rivalries, and the U.S. should be paying attention to it. It's not just the U.S. problem as well, it's for everybody.
As Dr. Oren said, the Middle East will hunt you down. Dr. Michael Oren, Colonel Richard Kemp, and Mr. Faisal Javid, thank you very much.